My name is Kennedy Ng, and I am very happy to present to you tonight the Dream City, Union City, New Jersey, which will be an option for the community to know the good things that happen in this beautiful city.
The city of Union City, a cosmopolitan city where almost all of us have seen each other. We are like a large family that through the management of our representatives, they help our citizens. And our people do volunteer work because they know that the city is run by a mayor who has shown that he is not the common politician, but that he works for his community. This program is an extension of information where we are going to have participation of personalities from the public and private sectors so that they can keep us informed of the community. May that be educational activities and everything that benefits us.
Good evening, Union City, New Jersey, the Dream City. As always, every Sunday, 7 p.m. Tonight, we have a very special guest, Mr. Marotta, Neil Marotta, who is the Union City, New Jersey rent control lawyer, our counselor, and he's here to provide information for the Dream City, Union City, New Jersey. Take advantage of this information.
Good evening, Kennedy. It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
Very good. How are you feeling tonight?
I feel good.
I think this interview will be, like I call it A+, because a lot of information that the city of Union City need in terms of rent control.
I believe it is very important for all the residents and property owners in the city. So hopefully they get an opportunity to watch.
Can you tell the audience, the Dream City, Union City, New Jersey, your background?
I was born and raised in Union City. I am a product of the Union City public school system. I went to Edison Grammar School.
Wow, that's good to know. Yep. I didn't know that.
yes. And also Emerson High School. I went to Jersey City State College when it was still called Jersey City State College. And then to Rutgers Law School, Camden. I actually graduated Emerson in 1982.
That's great.
So I am somewhat old.
Very good. Do you have your private office?
Yes, our office is located on 40th and Bergen Line in Union City, heart of Bergen Line Avenue. I practice with myself and my wife, who is my partner, and we do various things, but near and dear to my heart is rent control.
That's great to know. And I understand your father is a lawyer too.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I like your father.
Thank you. Happily. In fact, my father, as you know, is an accomplished musician as well.
I know that.
And he enjoys the rapport with you discussing music. My father is a trial attorney his whole life. Very strong person who has always looked after the rights of the people in Union City. I know he cares dearly for our mayor and senator, Brian P. Stack, and they have a wonderful relationship. And my father tries his best to help people as often as he can.
And I know that.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Neil, can you tell me a little bit about why the rent controlled office exists in the United States?
Sure. Well, I personally believe rent control is very important. And the reason we have rent control is so that people who live in a city their whole life can stay in that city. The reason for rent control is to stabilize the rents, because as we see here in Union City, which is right next to the Big Apple, very often property owners are able to obtain greater rents than they may be able to obtain elsewhere. And those rents will price out residents who lived in Union City their whole life because they don't make enough money. We want to keep those people here. They belong here, as well as those that make a lot of money. Everybody belongs.
That's a very strong reason.
Yes. So that is the purpose of rent control, to make it so that people can stay in their homes.
Neil, tell me something. I know that rent control of Union City have a monthly meeting, and we have the rent leveling board. What is the role of the rent leveling board in those meetings?
The rent leveling board, the purpose of the rent leveling board is to enforce and monitor the Union City rent control ordinance. I do have a copy here so people can take
Which
a look.
is the 334?
Yes, it's chapter 334 of the Union City ordinances.
And this ordinance is in the Union City website.
It is. Make sure, because we do keep some older ones there, that it is the December 5th, 2019 ordinance, and it's listed.
So this rent leveling board is like a court?
Correct. It is a quasi.
Can you define a little bit about that to the Dream City?
Exactly. So the rent control board is there to hear cases that may come before it. A lot of times there will be a dispute between a property owner and a tenant as to what the legal rent for the unit should be. Either party has the right to file an appeal of a decision of your office, the rent control office, and then the board has an opportunity to hear that matter. It'll be presented to the board. Either side can have an attorney. I know there is a tenant advocate for Union City who can represent an attorney if they do not have their own. And very often a property owner will have their attorney. So the board will hear the case, just like a judge. Okay? They'll hear evidence, they'll review it, and then they'll make a decision. So that is how they enforce the ordinance.
That's good to know. Those cases, in your own experience for years that you have been working in Union City, the cases that you have been involved in those meetings mostly are rent increase, or there are other items?
They're mainly rent calculation issues. Okay, what is the legal rent for that unit? However, we do have other matters that come before us. For example, if the case is an owner occupancy case, the owner might live in a three-family property. At that point, the property would be exempt from rent control. So the landlord may have to prove that they live there. In fact, they're required to provide an affidavit with backup documentation to help prove that they live there.
Very good. Well, in simple language for the community, what is a legal rent calculation? So they can know about it.
Yes, it's very important. The ordinance was adopted in 1973, the rent control ordinance. And at that time, the base rent, or whatever somebody was paying for rent, became the base rent. From that time forward...
And the base rent is the first rent that you pay when you rent an apartment for the first time.
That is correct. That is correct. In fact, if a property owner lived in a unit that was subject to rent control and always lived there and never rented that unit, and then moved out, when that tenant moves in, that will be the base rent for that property. So now the property owner is entitled to obtain a reasonable return on their investment. They don't do this for free. I'm sure they're happy to help their tenants, but they're entitled to make money. So the ordinance requires that they be given a reasonable return on their investment. Now, part of that deals with increases in rent. So, and this is where the stabilization of rents comes into play. So as I said, the landlord is entitled to have increases in rent, but that's where the stabilization comes in. The rent is only permitted to increase a certain amount a year. And that is based upon the Consumer Price Index.
And that's what we call it the CPI.
Exactly.
Can you define that in a simple way?
Sure. Yes.
Because sometimes they see the ordinance, all these information, numbers, and the tenants, the regular people, when I say regular people, the community looking for information, they do not understand the CPI. You can explain what is that?
I'm happy to do so. It is not an easy concept to understand. But basically, it is an indication of inflation. So as prices go up, prices for materials to maintain the property, as these items go up, the landlord is entitled to increase the rent by the CPI to keep pace with that. And then in this manner, they will continue to obtain a reasonable return on their investment.
That's a good definition. Neil, I have the ordinance that you brought it, which is chapter 334.
This is what guides us. In fact, we are required to stay and follow in the parameters and to follow the ordinance. It guides us on how we interact with both landlords and tenants, how we calculate rents. For example, in the ordinance, there's a provision on new construction.
Exactly.
Okay. If a property owner builds a new house, the state law, and we put it in the ordinance itself, provides that the owner can claim an exemption from rent control.
Sure. So this ordinance, and I guess everything when we update the ordinance have to pass through the commissioners and the mayor
correct.
to be approved. Can you explain a little bit how that works when something have to be updated?
Definitely. So the ordinance, a lot of times issues come up that are not addressed in the ordinance. And what we'll do is we'll review that, we'll consider it, we'll discuss it with the governing body, and we may decide then to amend the ordinance to address this document and to address that issue. In fact, I call the ordinance a living, breathing document because
That's a better name.
it has to change from time to time to meet the needs of the community and the times. So yes, so what happens is at that point, then in discussion with the Corporation Council for the city, we'll go ahead, we'll draft an amendment to the ordinance. The mayor and council will put it for introduction, and then the public have an opportunity to comment on that change.
That's very important.
Yes.
There's
and then-
always the community that have to have the opportunity to to give feedback.
Yes, for input.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Can you explain the community about the senior citizens? Do they have the same CPI as other tenants?
They do not. The ordinance provides an added protection for seniors. The mayor and commissioners, in their, what I believe, wisdom, said the older people in our community are an important part of our community. They form a base that they have so much knowledge and history. We do not want them to be priced out of Union City. So what the ordinance does is it limits the increase for a senior citizen that qualifies for that protection and makes it the CPI the maximum of 2%. So the senior has to be 62 years of age, and they have to meet certain income requirement. Actually, it is a state figure, a state number set by the state of New Jersey, and then we're able to go ahead and we have that number. A senior citizen can come in and say, I'm 62 and I understand I can have some added protection from increases in rent. And then we'll ask them for their documentation to prove how much their income is for the whole unit.
Exactly. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have had cases in Union City rent control offices that senior citizens didn't know about these regulations. And now for example, they are 70 years old. Mm-hmm. They come to the office and they say, look, I didn't know about this regulation, about the senior citizens have different CPI regulations, and can I get reimbursed?
I have heard that situation arise from time to time where the person says, I didn't know about it, I'd like to get it retroactive so that my rent would be lower. Unfortunately, we cannot do that because the same as a tenant has to know what their rent will be going forward, the landlord has the right to know what the rent will be going forward. There is a balance. And so otherwise it would require the landlord to go back and provide money that they believe they were collecting lawfully. So a senior citizen, as soon as they apply, that's when the 2% limit would take place.
Good to know. The Dream City, as I told you at the beginning of the program, Mr. Marotta is just in details bringing a lot of information for the community, and this is about rent control. Rent control is very important for the community, especially for the community of Union City, New Jersey, where we have a lot of percentages of buildings under rent control. I'm going to ask you something that maybe people don't know. A lot of landlords know, but tenants don't know about it. The rent control department have different programs that maybe they can adjust the rent. And can you talk a little bit about those programs like capital improvements, the hardships, and the new buildings and things like that?
Sure. One of the main programs we have is the Capital Improvement Program. The Capital Improvement Program enables a property owner to obtain reimbursement for the cost that it put into their building. For example, in fact, the best example is the property owner wants to put in a sprinkler system for the benefit of their tenants. That is a capital improvement. They would be able to go ahead, install the system, and then go to the rent control office and get reimbursed. A formula will be put in place to reimburse them as a surcharge to the tenant's rent.
Good to know.
Okay, and it's a surcharge. It's
Exactly.
not a rent increase.
Exactly.
Okay, and just one more thing important to know: the capital improvement has to extend the useful life of the property or add value to it in a significant way. It is not just painting the walls, or if there's a hole, fixing the wall. It has to be a true capital improvement.
They should follow the requirements of a capital improvement. And all those forms, applications are in the Union City website, bilingual, Spanish and English too.
Correct. And the office, as you know, is always there to answer any questions
Exactly.
and help guide any landlords in that.
What about the hardship?
The hardship is a very important provision within the rent control ordinance. As I mentioned earlier, landlord is entitled to receive a reasonable return on their investment. If the cost to run that property are too great, and the formula is in the ordinance, at that point they can apply for what's called a hardship increase. And they would be entitled, if they meet the formula, to increase their rent so that they are receiving a reasonable return on their investment. It's a very important provision.
Very good. Neil, when I came to the city, to my department, rent control office, I found one of the program, the new constructions. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there has been a little, I will say, confusions about new constructions. What is a new constructions? Sure. And the regulations and requirements to follow to be out of rent control?
Okay. The new construction is in the ordinance. The statute, it's actually a state statute that provides new construction is exempt from rent control. And the basis of that is to encourage development of new properties. However, the legislature, the government, has put into effect requirements to obtain that exemption. For example, it just does not happen. The property owner, when they build that property, must request or claim the exemption more than 30 days before they receive their certificate of occupancy. If they do not do that, and there is case law on it.
So that's very important to know.
Yes.
I know it, but maybe a lot of people don't know that.
Yes.
Even investors, they don't know that. In the moment that you apply to have a new building, you go to to planning board, zoning, all these committees in the city. Who is the person who should advise the developers about that regulation in terms of new building, so to be exempt from rent control?
Well, the state statute requires that the property owner send the claim for exemption to the construction code official. So my recommendation would be for the construction code official, when they're getting the permits to build the building, they can go ahead and they can comment to the developer. However, it's really the developer's responsibility to know about the law.
Exactly, but for example, I'm a rich person. Mm-hmm. I don't know about those regulations. I just put in the money and I want a very beautiful building for the community. So I understand that when you go to planning board, zoning board, most of the time, I would say 99%, if you are investing a lot of money, millions of dollars sometimes, you have a lawyer, you have an architect, you have, a traffic studies, organizations. Who is the person in your own legal advices that should go to building department and apply for that regulation to be exempt from rent control?
Well, I believe, first of all, even though it is the owner's responsibility, their lawyer should be advising them on it, okay, and let them know that this exists. And at that point, also their contractor might be in a position to know that it exists. And then what they have to do is send a letter to the construction code official claiming the exemption. In
And
fact,
it's not that hard.
No,
it's a
it's
letter
just
to explain.
Yeah.
So it will be documented there.
Exactly. It's not even a request. They're entitled to it, but they have to claim it. But one more important thing, any lease that they have for the new tenants coming in has to have specific language that this property, this unit is exempt from rent control. And that's very important because
very important.
Because the tenant has the right to know that the rent may be increased in the future beyond what rent control permits.
So I'm going to give you an example. Like, there is a building in there that we know is what we call it a new building, 20 years old building, but never registered in the building department to be exempt. Now, we as administrator of rent control, with your help, we find out that this building never registered as to be exempt. What happened?
Okay, so at that point, what we do is we send a letter to the property owner and we request that they register. But we also say, if you claim that your property is exempt from rent control, please send us the information that shows that it is exempt from rent control. And at that point, we will review the information. And if we agree with the property owner, it ends there. If we do not, we will say you have to come before the board for a hearing, and the board, the rent control board, will make a determination whether it is exempt or not exempt from rent control.
So in case the rent leveling board determines that the building will be on the rent control, what happens to the tenants actually living in that building?
Okay. The ordinance was brought forward for enforcement purposes in approximately 2018. So at that point, the landlord would not have to reduce the rents all the way back to when they first built the property. For example, 2002, okay? The property might have been built, the rents might have been $700, and now they're $1,400. The landlord would not have to go back and then charge rent of $700. Since the ordinance was specifically...
It does have to be very important, the tenants to know in cases like this, because they could be under the impression that they can have reimbursed money from years back. That's not the truth.
That is not the case.
Okay.
And it's very important that they know that. And this way, in fairness to the property owner who did not realize that they had to go ahead and claim the exemption, the rent control will take effect from 2018 on. And the rents that they had at that time would be the base rent for that property.
Something that is very unique. I mean, you have explained to the city, to the community, to the Dream City, Union City, New Jersey, about all these regulations, about our Ordinance 334. And then COVID-19 came to the picture, 2019. And a very important document came to the moratorium. Can you very briefly and just right to the point, what was the moratorium about?
Okay. At this time, it was one of the worst times that we've ever lived through. Not only Union City, but the country as a whole.
The whole planet.
The whole planet, exactly. And Union City and Hudson County were hit very hard. People lost their jobs, people could not have childcare, and they were in desperate straits. So at that point, the Board of Commissioners and the mayor, along with recommendations from the Rent Control Office, said, okay, this is a rough time. What we'll do is we'll put a moratorium on rent increases during the COVID period. In other words, the governor had set forth a state of emergency, and we tied the moratorium to the state of emergency. So during this time, tenants would not have to pay an increase in rent. They had some stabilization.
That was a very great help from the city of Union City about the moratorium. And the commissioners and Mayor Stack.
I agree, and it really helped people very much. But it also enabled the landlords to be able to start collecting that after their increases after the state of emergency, provided they did the proper thing with registrations during the state of emergency. And the effective date when increases could take effect was March 1st, 2022.
And that started like a month or a couple months after the COVID-19 came to the picture.
Exactly. When actually 60 days, or I can't remember, it might have been 2
months. It was March, something
yes.
Like, okay. I know the Mayor Stack is in pro of tenants, helping people, not only tenants, the whole community. And I believe, especially these 3 years, 2019, 2021, and still, Mayor Stack have been in pro of tenants, defending tenants. And I know that we have a tenant advocate in the city of Union City. Can you explain a little bit what is the role of the tenant advocate?
Yes, there are actually 2 tenant advocates, and one is for the rent control matters, and the other one is a general tenant advocate. And I think it is a brilliant and caring, compassionate idea to have an attorney who can represent people who cannot afford an attorney. Very often property owners have their own attorney. They bring an action against a tenant for whatever reason, they go to court, and that tenant is unrepresented. I would like everybody to know that they are entitled to have representation through the tenant advocate's office, and it is a wonderful resource.
And this is free of charge. Yes?
My understanding is it's free of charge. And the tenant advocate is also available for rent control matters. So if it's not court, okay, it is similar, but it is not court. But their rights are definitely affected.
It's not court, but they feel that someone is taking care of them legally.
Exactly. And this way they have that representation.
Very good. Neil, you as a lawyer, and I know that you understand very well all these things about rent control. It is a balance about tenants and landlords. Mm-hmm. What would be the advice for any landlords or investor that want to buy a building on the rent control in Union City?
That's a great question. It's extremely important for that investor to find out what the legal rents are for the units in that property. Unfortunately, we've seen sad stories where...
And that's the reason I'm asking you, because I don't want to see people losing money anyway, you know.
Exactly, and I do appreciate you asking it. We've seen situations where somebody buys a property and the seller showed them rent registration statements that were not accurate. And then when the tenant went to the rent control office to find out what the legal rent was, all of a sudden the rent for that tenant was substantially less. And that's a horrible thing to happen.
It is.
So for the new property owner who was not aware of it. So what my advice, and what is actually in the ordinance, requires that anybody who's looking to purchase a property in Union City that is subject to rent control to request a rent calculation for all the units in the building. This way they know going in what the situation is, what are they getting into, what is the real value of that property.
Exactly. So that's a good explanation and a great recommendation for landlords. Any people, sometimes we have a very rich people investing, but sometimes we have people that sacrifice their entire life.
Correct.
You know, saving little money little by little, and we don't want those people to suffer. Any recommendation briefly to any family that want to come to Union City looking for an apartment and they don't know about rent control? Very briefly.
I believe that the same as a landlord should know about rent control, the tenant should know about rent control. Because
but you know that there's a lot of people coming from different countries.
That's correct.
Not even different countries, but they don't know the language. It's the language barrier, and they just look for an apartment. They say $3,000, and they don't know. And then they find out that those apartments or that apartment is under rent control.
That is correct. So prior to them entering into a lease, they have the opportunity to come and meet with the tenant advocate if they'd like. But they can also come and say, hey, what is the legal rent for that unit I'm going to be leasing? And then they can make sure that they're paying the correct rent for that unit.
Thank you. Mr. Marotta, anything that you can add or say that we didn't cover?
I would like to go back to, well, first I'd like to thank you for having me today. It's a wonderful program that Union City has. And
the Dream City.
The Dream City, and it's very important. I would like to thank Mayor Stack and the commissioners for the help, the assistance, the compassion they have to help the tenants in Union City. It's so important. Gentrification is a terrible thing to the extent that people who lived here their whole lives all of a sudden may find themselves unable to afford to live in Union City any longer. That changes Union City. It will not be Union City anymore. And thanks to the mayor and the commissioners, that can be regulated to an extent that both property owners and tenants can exist in harmony with that balance that you've spoken about.
That's Mayor Stack. Okay?
That is correct.
A heart, big heart. As long as the commissioners have, it's a great team, and that's how we call it the Dream City, Union City, New Jersey. It's not about the mayor, about the commissioners, about you, about me. It's the entire community. And I really, Mr. Marotta, I'm gonna call you Neil.
Yeah.
Neil, okay?
Yeah.
Appreciate that you are here, for this interview. I know that you are like ping pong, very busy all the time.
Yes.
But I believe that this interview, I believe personally, one of the best, and a lot of information that the community, not only the tenants, the community in general needed to know.
I agree. And thank you again for having me tonight.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay.
My name is Kennedy NG.